Sometimes we ask questions, and sometimes we get asked questions that fascinate us. One such question was asked when a friend asked me, "Hey, I wonder how many Pokemon that I remember from Gen 1 are in Scarlet and Violet." You see, it was this person's first Pokemon game they'd properly sat down and played since Gen 1, so the concept of the national dex was something they'd never had to consider. This led me down a rabbit hole of information, statistics, and data in regards to this breakdown, and I began to wonder in my 5th hour of insanity, looking into this data, if you could build a model to predict the Pokemon volumes in the DLC, and also if you could predict future Pokemon Pokedex breakdowns. Hello, I am Parasitic Serum, and this is Debug.Games, and today we'll be debugging the Pokedex for the Paldea region, and Galar, I guess, and Hisui as well. Pokemon has been a main staple in the video gaming and franchise world for well over 25 years, and was one of the first games to have a focus on collectathons. The Pokedex is probably the most famous monster encyclopedia in existence, detailing now over 1,000 Pokemon, and for a good chunk of the last quarter century, completing your Pokedex was the main goal in Pokemon. This challenge got incrementally harder with each release, as starting with 151, we then went to 251, then 386, then 493, 649, and well, you get the picture. However, somewhere around 809 Pokemon, this got a little bit much for the games with the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield. We got the first Pokemon games not to include the previous 809 Pokemon, opting for a select grouping of those Pokemon from different regions. This then continued onwards as the DLC in Sword and Shield added some, but not all Pokemon, and the remakes of Diamond and Pearl, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl chose to give players the original 493 Pokemon from that generation, and not the 405 Pokemon that had come since. Legends Arceus further continued this trend by having a Pokedex with a selection of specific Pokemon. However, with the release of Generation 9 and the Paldea Pokedex, it looks like the limited selection Pokedex is here to stay, and National Dex a feature relegated to Pokemon Home. So this led to a conversation I alluded to earlier with a friend that hadn't touched Pokemon games in years, wondering which Pokemon they would recognise, and it suddenly dawned on me that not all of their original favourites would actually be in this game. I then began to wonder what the breakdown of the Pokedex by region would look like, and, well, I began to ask more and more questions. Now, I could give you just the flat answers and you would get them, however, I want you to truly experience the journey I went through to find this interesting information, because, well, if I have to go through this insanity, you do too. Before we begin though, I just want to give a quick shout out to Cerebi for where I found a lot of factual Pokemon information and was able to use that and pivot a lot of it. So thanks to the team over there, they're always fantastic and have basically never led me astray, giving me all my Pokemon information for the past 10 or so years. Also, big shout out to Will Solom, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, on GitHub, who had a fantastic CSV with all Pokemon up until the end of Gen 8 dumped on it, and this actually made some of these stats a lot easier to figure out, and it will also help with future projects as well, as I've got some ideas of how I want to take this further. Yes, I'm going to take this further. Let's track this from the beginning, I guess. Pokemon Sword and Shield launched on the 15th of November 2019. These were the first full games on the Nintendo Switch and the first full Pokemon games you could play on your TV. The games took you on an adventure through the Galar region, based on the United Kingdom, with exploration of the New World area and Dynamax Pokemon phenomenon. Personally, still a Mega Evolution fan, and we can discuss the Pokemon combat gimmicks another day. Sword and Shield launched with a Pokedex of 400 Pokemon, giving us half of the total Pokemon available. With the regional Pokedex being made up by less than a quarter of new Pokemon, the fill-out comes from the 7 other regions. When broken down, we get 51 Kanto Pokemon, 35 Johto, 42 Hoenn, 38 Sinnoh, 85 Unova, 32 Kalos, and 36 Alola. This of course says nothing for Mega Evolutions and Z moves because these aren't included in Gen 8. This leaves us with some rather isolated numbers and information that simply tells us what Pokemon are included in Sword and Shield. It was the first time we'd ever had to think about this, but the breakdown was interesting nonetheless. Are there any favourites? Kalos, Alola, Sinnoh and Johto have a lower amount of Pokemon, with around 32 to 38 included. However, Hoenn, Kanto and Unova all have higher amounts. Kanto is of course the home of Pokemon, so it would make sense for this to be prioritised. Hoenn is my personal favourite, but other than that I can't really justify the higher amount, until I look at the counter Pokemon in that dex, with Hoenn, Unova and Kanto all having 110 plus Pokemon in their dex, whereas the 4 other regions are all below that count. This is something that caught my eye and I definitely want to hang on to, but we're far too early to draw in any conclusions. A few months after the games came out, we finally got some DLC in the announcement that Pokemon Sword and Shield would be getting more Pokemon across the 2 DLC sets, the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra. To make this understandable going forwards, I'm going to consider these 2 DLC as one Pokedex unit, as ultimately that's what created the complete Pokedex in Galar. The DLC added 8 new Galar Pokemon across the 2, 7 Alola Pokemon, 17 Kalos, 38 Unova, 25 Sinnoh, 43 Hoenn, 21 Johto, and 64 Kanto. I feel like I'm at a bingo event and just reading out numbers. Anyway. Interestingly though, there are also Pokemon that are transfer only in this set and don't show up in the actual Pokedex. I've put these up on the video for you to see. This gives us total numbers for 72 Alola Pokemon, 52 Kalos, 130 Unova, 72 Sinnoh, 99 Hoenn, 61 Johto, and 116 Kanto. Now, the higher amounts of certain regions make sense to me. Alola and Kalos have less Pokemon than a region like Kanto or Unova that both have 150 plus Pokemon. The percentage number that mirrors these counts also seems to reflect a fairly stable, with an average of each Pokedex making up 12% of the total dex in Galar, and an average of 74% of each dex appearing. With 7 older decks in these games, this makes sense. I did also categorize and calculate the Hisui Pokedex in my travels for these answers, however, direct dex comparisons are a little harder here. However, the average in Hisui is displayed now on the video, and we'll be categorizing these later in our conclusion. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet finally released on the 18th of November 2022. The new Pokemon this time came in at around 103, more than Pokemon numbers in the more recent regions such as Alola, Kalos, and Galar. However, this means that the Pokedex has also changed for Paldea. Kanto has 44 Pokemon, Johto has 41, and Hoenn has 40. Sinnoh has 46, Unova has 34, Kalos has 25, Alola gets 24, and Galar comes in with around 43. Each region makes up around 9% per region of the total Pokedex, and an average number per region of 37 Pokemon. Galar obviously being the turbulent exception there, but I guess that makes sense. It's the most recent game other than these ones, and they obviously want these Pokemon to still be relevant. And again, these numbers on their own aren't that descriptive, but they do begin to paint a concept. When it comes to raw Pokemon numbers, including Pokemon Legends Arceus is a little bit more difficult, as its Pokedex is only around 242 Pokemon, and not the 400 mark that the base game Sword and Shield and base game Scarlet and Violet include. So to make the raw number comparison so far, we are only going to be looking at the 2 main series base games for now. Legends Arceus will be coming back to later in a different factoring. Scarlet and Violet has an average of each dex of 37 Pokemon, whereas Sword and Shield has 46. Of course, this makes sense, as with another 100 Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet and another region to consider, the number of Pokemon we can get in from other regions has to shrink. This is where we're going to resummon Legends Arceus, which has an average percentage from other regions at 8.83%. Just below Scarlet's and Violet's. This initially looks a little bit odd, but when you consider that Sinnoh has to be removed from this calculation as 100% of the Pokemon appear, 7 new Pokemon get added, and the Pokedex is just over half the size of the other main games, it does make sense why this percentage would be lower. So what have we learned? I've been throwing numbers and percentages at you while thinking about Pokemon with no clear story. I guess it's time I started explaining myself. In terms of trend data we can look at, the results are unfortunately inconclusive. I wish I could have taken you on this journey with more concrete answers, but we've only had 2.5 games with these limited Pokedex, and even when factoring into it DLC, there's just not enough raw data to make a conclusive report, or to build trend data from. It's not really a trend yet. But I don't think this journey was a waste of time, or at least I hope not for my own sanity. We have learned that the averages are within a range of each other, and that there are discernible similarities between regions across different games in some cases. How this data helps us is something only time will tell. Now on to the interesting bit. a prediction. The Scarlet and Violet DLC has been confirmed, so how many Pokemon do we think there will be? So to do this, we're going to make the assumption that matching the base game, Scarlet and Violet will end up having around 691 Pokemon. For ease of planning, I'm going to call this 700, which means we'll get around 300 additional Pokemon based on this assumption. If we assume that the 9 extra on this 691 Pokemon are going to be Paldea newbies, similar to those that have been announced and similar to those in the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra, and that the exclusive 103 Pokemon of Paldea, this gives us a remaining makeup of Pokemon from other regions of around 588. In the final Pokedex in Galar, we had an average of 74% of each Pokedex being used, but this would need to go down for newer games as new Pokedex and new Pokemon come out. If we had to factor this at about 60% of each other Pokedex, giving us the numbers you see on screen now as my estimation. Obviously, this leaves us with around a 20 Pokemon deficit, but it won't be exact between regions, so I'm curious to see how close I'll end up being, and when that final Pokedex is out. The number would make sense though, as the 103 new Pokemon, Paldea does make up roughly 10% of the Pokedex, so a 10% delta in all Pokedex in this situation does make sense to adjust for a new one. So, to answer the original question, I was poised. Charlotte, there's 44 Kanto Pokemon in this game right now. That's how many you should remember. Well, that was quite a long-winded way to get to the answer, but I hope you enjoyed this journey. We will be revisiting this video when the full dex is out, and I'm fascinated by how the breakdowns is going to work, and how my prediction is going to end up being placed. If you enjoyed this rabbit hole, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. If you'd like to look at more game-related stuff in the future, then I also do weekly content on TikTok and do stream as well. Until next time, I mean, this is insanity, so we'll see about the next time if I haven't been sectioned. But until the next time, I have been Parasitic Zerom. Goodbye.